Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Kazakhstan is looking towards a constitutional reform. Nothing new by post-Soviet politics standards. President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev now says 2026 will be decisive, with a referendum and amendments so extensive they may amount to a new constitution. But ambition is not the same as transformation. Kazakhstan's reforms are not being sold as revolution, but as a recalibration. A stronger state, cleaner institutions, more efficient governance, and carefully managed participation. The real question is not what these reforms promise on paper, but what kind of political system they are actually designed to stabilize. So let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Kazakhstan is in the midst of yet another political transformation that President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev abruptly announced. This time, Tokayev is pushing for the abolition of several state bodies in a bid to reshuffle governmental structures to his liking. The abolition of Kazakhstan's National Kurultai, an annually convened advisory board serving as a dialogue platform between government and civil society, was announced suddenly on January 20th. This comes despite the fact that the Kurultai was founded by President Tokayev himself. The Assembly of the People of Kazakhstan is another institution that will be dismantled according to the announcement. Founded in 1995 by former President Nursultan Nazarbayev, the Assembly was tasked with representing the various ethnic groups of Kazakhstan and strengthening national coexistence. Tokayev said that these institutions would be replaced to make way for new mechanisms meant to facilitate the state's interaction with civil society. He has also proposed creating new posts, including the Vice President of Kazakhstan. The Vice President would be directly appointed by the President and confirmed by a simple majority vote in Parliament. Proponents view the announced changes as an effort to reduce state inefficiencies and distribute power to other actors. Yet critics note that the abolition of certain state bodies and the creation of others is unlikely to have any real impact on the functioning of Kazakh executive authority.
And now let's zone in on the east-planning portion of our show. Kazakhstan remains a country where key positions are occupied by those carefully selected for their loyalty to executive leadership. Since assuming power in 2019, President Tokayev's changes have ensured these posts are exclusively occupied by his cronies. Here's a closer look of what political reforms in Kazakhstan actually look like.
While claims of reducing inefficiencies may be a convenient veneer, the outcome of political reorganization in Kazakhstan seldom diminishes the all-encompassing power of the executive. Tokayev's reforms are an exception. When he first took power in 2019, Tokayev presented his presidency as a transition that would build a so-called new Kazakhstan. In reality, this centered primarily on the consolidation of power within the senior ranks of the Kazakh government. The mass civil unrest over fuel price hikes in early 2022 was the ultimate pretext for Tokayev to seize the moment by cracking down not only on protesters but on officials who were viewed as disloyal. Tokayev also used the unrest to push through populist reforms aimed at pandering to the public while making little substantive change to the state. This includes the June 2022 amendment to the Kazakh constitution, which supposedly mandates that the country's natural resources belong to the people. Kazakhstan's politics remain dominated by the executive. While the country has undergone a power transition with Tokayev, there have yet to be fundamental changes in the functioning of the regime.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Kazakhstan enters 2026 with a familiar but carefully rebranded message: reform, order, and stability in that order. President Tokayev's January address and interview were framed not as routine communication, but as something closer to a governing manifesto. Domestic reform, social policy, security, and foreign affairs were woven into a single narrative, designed to show coherence in a world Tokayev described as increasingly unstable. At the center of this vision is the state itself. Tokayev's argument is blunt. A fair society cannot exist without a strong state, rule of law, and equality before the law. In Central Asia, this language has a double meaning. On the surface, it responds to genuine public frustration with corruption, captured institutions, and unequal access to services. Underneath, it also signals that reform will be tightly managed from above, not driven by uncontrolled political competition from below. This is especially clear in the social policy section of Tokayev's agenda. Kazakhstan continues to define itself as a social state with commitments to healthcare, education, science, and culture. At the same time, Tokayev openly acknowledges distortions in private education and healthcare, where public money has often served private interests. His warning that social support must not become a source of parasitism or fraud is not accidental language. It prepares the ground for stricter state control over benefits, subsidies, and social spending, framed as restoring fairness rather than limiting access. Institutional reform is where things become more structural. Tokayev's proposal to move to a unicameral parliament is presented as a solution to inefficiency. In theory, removing an upper chamber speeds up legislation and simplifies responsibility. In practice, the key issue is not speed but balance. See, a single chamber can enhance accountability, but only if elections are genuinely competitive and parliamentary oversight is meaningful. Otherwise, efficiency simply means faster execution of executive preference. The same logic applies to the proposed vice presidency. A vice president confirmed by parliament sounds like a stabilizing innovation, and historically, such offices can provide continuity and succession management. But in hybrid systems, vice presidencies often function less as independent centers of power and more as instruments of elite coordination. Who occupies the post, how autonomous it is, and whether parliamentary approval is more than procedural will determine whether this office strengthens institution or formalizes succession planning. There's literally so many more issues to mention, but taken together, Kazakhstan's proposed constitutional reforms are not revolutionary. Their success will not depend on institutional diagrams or referendum results, but on whether implementation constrains elite capture, enforces accountability, and tolerates genuine oversight. The real reform begins only when the rules start binding those who write them. And now, here to share more light on the issue is Bruce Penier, board member of the Caspian Policy Center. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for inviting me here.
So today we are looking at Kazakhstan and them looking towards their constitutional reform. Do you think that this is something that is going to bring substantial change to the country, or is it more like one of my New Year, New Me resolutions in my relation with the gym?
Well, for the moment, I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt to President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. He seems to feel that these changes are going to usher in a new era in Kazakhstan, make parliament much more effective and dynamic. That said, of course, this is far from the first time that we've seen these kind of changes in the parliament or even in the constitution. I mean, Tokayev himself said that there's so many changes that are about to be made to the constitution that it is, in effect, a new constitution that they're going to be having a referendum on. The big feature is, of course, the parliament, as you mentioned. But as I said, the number of seats have gone up and down. It's been bicameral for about 30 years now, but it was unicameral before that. So on the surface of it, I don't see any major differences here. But of course, the commission is still drafting the amendments, so there might be some surprises and something really substantial put into the final draft.
Right. And attempts at reform seems to be quite a policy standard for a lot of these post-Soviet countries. But do you think it has more to do with the volatility of their political structure, or what contributed to these attempts at reforms in a more rapid manner than other areas?
Well, of course, if you listen to the presidents of these countries, they're always saying that we've reached some kind of new level, or that we're making progress. But to make the next step, we're going to have to do some changes, tweak the system a little bit. Kazakhstan had a referendum in 2002, and during that referendum, they said that a lot of the powers from the executive branch, which was termed the super presidency, were transferred over to the parliament, both the upper and lower house. So it made it still a pro-presidential system, but not a super presidential system, and parliament had more power. And now here we are 4 years later, and they're changing it again because they're saying, well, okay, we need to fine tune it just a little bit more. We've heard this in other countries too. at the end of the day, after 35 years of these changes going back and forth, what we still have is strongly pro-presidential systems throughout Central Asia. So even though they've changed the structure of parliament several times and changed their constitution several times, they all seem to have ended up in the same place 35 years later.
Where does that leave President Where does that leave President Tokayev? Because, well, we do know that he's been pursuing these sort of reform, but what is going to become of his political future?
There's a couple of interesting moments here. The first thing, okay, Tokayev is a seasoned, I have to mention, he's a seasoned politician. Right? He's been prime minister, he's been foreign minister, he was the representative to the OSCE for Kazakhstan. So he's certainly not a novice in any way. Now, under the new system, the first thing we have to remember is that they're going to make the bicameral parliament a unicameral parliament. Okay, it's supposed to propose right now at 145 seats. To become a member of parliament, you have to be in one of the registered political parties, and there's only one political party that even remotely qualifies as an opposition party. So what you have is a bunch of pro-presidential parties that are being registered, and they're the only ones that can put candidates forward to be in parliament. So he has a bunch of loyalists, parties that are loyal to him that are going to be running for these seats in office. So they're unlikely to contradict him at all. There's another thing that's going to change about this, which is kind of interesting, is the succession system is going to change. Kazakhstan had a vice president, the post of vice president, until 30 years ago when they made constitutional changes. And now they're going to reinstate the post of vice president. As the Constitution reads now, if the president is unable to perform his duties, the head of the Senate is the next in line to take over in power. Well, they're not going to have a Senate anymore. They're going to have a unicameral parliament, so that doesn't work anymore. So he's reintroduced the post of vice presidency. Now, the president defines the powers of the vice president, right? So he's next in line to take over. The president tells him how much he can do and how much he can't do. A lot of people have interpreted this, and I think rightly, as this is the heir, the successor to Tokayev, that's going to be appointed vice president. And we'll have to see how that system works out. Like I said, it's so ill-defined at this point that the president's just going to tell you what you can do and what you can't do. Obviously, people will be watching very closely to see what exactly the vice president can and can't do.
So in the grand scheme of things, we still see the presidency holds a majority of the power. Do you think that these changes actually have a significant impact, be it in the region or in the broader geopolitical aspect, or do you think this is mostly something internal?
Because all the parliaments in Central Asia have back and forth so many times, I think you're almost going to have to say that this is internal. There's something that they're looking at in Kazakhstan that, for some reason, and like I said, we don't have all the amendments yet. There's still a 100-member commission that's working on all the amendments they want to put forward. There's something that they want to change in the system. Now, it could just be the vice presidency post. It could just be the vice presidency, like I said. And that's to appoint the heir apparent and groom him and get him ready to take over the presidency. Tokayev should leave office in 2029, but this is another thing that is worth remembering in Central Asia, which has happened in several of the Central Asian countries. When you overhaul the constitution so much that you, in effect, have a new constitution, it raises questions about what the president's term status is. And we've seen this, like I said, several times. If you have a new constitution, does the previous election of the president under the old constitution count anymore, or as they say, does that zero it out, meaning that the president is eligible to be elected again for another term or perhaps two terms? So that's another question that's hanging over this whole situation at the moment and the changes to the Constitution. Once they do pass this, what Tokayev himself has called effectively a new Constitution, does that mean that he is eligible to run again for office? So we have to wait and see what the ruling is on that one.
Is there an argument to be made that these uncertainty and lack of clarity is not a bug but a feature, that with all these shuffling of the Constitution, the rules, that would give Tokayev a better chance or an opportunity to be reelected and staying in a longer term than he would have?
Yeah, I mean, that was my immediate thought when I saw that when he said it's effectively a new constitution. Like I said, we've seen this. This just happened in Uzbekistan a few years ago, for instance, right? The president of the country was serving his second and constitutionally last 5-year term in office. They changed the constitution. They made the presidential term 7 years instead of 5. The constitutional court and the experts on the constitution in the country all of a sudden ruled that the 2 previous 5-year terms didn't count because we have a new constitution for 7 years. So, and we've seen exactly the same kind of thing happen in Kazakhstan, where they all of a sudden they make drastic amendments to the constitution, and the presidential term doesn't count. Tokayev himself did this. He was elected in 2019 when Nursultan Nazarbayev stepped down. I mentioned they passed a referendum in 2022. He ran again in 2023 for what was supposed to be a single 6-year term. So, I mean, he's done it himself. And that's really, like I said, that's a big question for me, is what does this effectively new constitution mean? He said it's not going to make it a super presidential system again. I find no reason to doubt that. But it is and always has been a very strong pro-presidential system. Does he want to leave? Especially because he himself was a hand-picked successor to Nursultan Nazarbayev. And that didn't work out and led to unrest in early 2022 when Nazarbayev loyalists effectively tried to oust Tokayev. So how much trust does he have in grooming a successor and leaving office in 3 years' time and handing it over to somebody that supposedly he trusts to keep him safe while he is, fading into the sunset and retiring from politics?
Does this not flip the legitimacy of the Constitution on its head and hurt the credibility when it could be kind of shifted around in the drop of a dime?
I'd have to say yes to that. I mean, this is, the good thing, I suppose, for Kazakhstan and anyone who does this in the future is it's simply been done so much that it doesn't raise too many eyebrows anymore, unfortunately. But yes, you'd have to wonder if you had some kind of constitutional guarantees under the current constitution, are they still going to be good under the one that they're going to have a referendum on later this year, probably early next year? And what are your constitutional guarantees worth under the new constitution, knowing that you could vote on amendments that will strike that down, 3 or 4 years down the line? So it's very upsetting to a lot of people, and it certainly doesn't speak well for stability of the political system within the country. That said, of course, when you have a strong pro-presidential system, you're unlikely to see any radical changes in the country. But still, on paper, what can you believe in, and what will be valid 5 years from now is always a big question.
Right. Is there anything within their political system that has any sort of continuity or stability that people can hold on to? Whereas this constitution, like we were talking about, it being more volatile than faith building.
That's really tough. I don't want to discard everything in the Constitution. I mean, all the constitutions of Central Asia read very well. They had European and other help preparing these things. You have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of association, all those kind of things written in the Constitution. In fact, there's all kinds of restrictions on these things, and there always have been. So, the fact that they're tinkering with it again, sure, you have a lot of rights on paper. But in fact, when you go out and I can give you another example. In 2019, there was someone when they made the switch of power, and Nursultan Nazarbayev handed over power to Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. There were protests in the country, and someone wrote a big passage from the Constitution that said the people are ultimately responsible for making the decisions of the country. That person was detained and jailed for a few days, right? And all he did was write down an exact passage out of the Constitution. This will give you an idea of the situation. And again, that said, Kazakhstan is more likely to pay attention to its constitution and at least present an argument for why things seem to jibe or do not seem to jibe with what's written in the Constitution than other Central Asian countries. In some Central Asian countries, you can be arrested, jailed, lose property, all kinds of things, even though you can point to the passages, the articles in the Constitution that guarantee this, and the government doesn't care. At least Kazakhstan will give you an explanation for why this is happening to you.
All right. In the meantime, we'll have to wait and see how this new reform is going to work. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Russia's Interior Ministry is experiencing severe personnel shortages as police officers continue to resign at a pace that outstrips recruitment.
Understaffing has reached 40% in some police units, driven by declining prestige, low wages, and social benefits that no longer match market conditions. The shortages are especially pronounced in patrol, criminal investigation, drug control, and investigative departments. Nearly half of experienced officers left the service in 2024, worsening operational strain and internal morale issues, while authorities plan to raise police salaries and expand benefits such as housing support. Critics argue that these increases are expected to be limited.
Uzbekistan has delayed the start of construction on its first nuclear power plant, which is being built by Russia's state atomic energy company.
The pouring of concrete for the facility's foundation, originally scheduled for March, has been postponed until at least December. Officials say that the delay is due to unresolved technical and regulatory issues, as well as outstanding financial arrangements related to the project. Authorities emphasize that construction will only proceed once all required permits and approvals are in place, describing the first concrete stage as a critical milestone that demands caution.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.